Where is the government on this at the moment? And most of you are probably going to be able to understand and guess where the government is on most of it. The government response is measured in years. You know, they've got the turning circle of the aircraft carrier on one of Siam's entrepreneurial ships. You know, they do not react quickly. Doesn't mean that they won't react, though. And that is the key point around all of this. So in terms of the key publications and their key announcements as to what they're doing, it was back in 2014-15 where they pushed a call for information. They asked the public and those involved in the crypto space, you know, come and help us, come and teach us, come and, you know, let us know what we should be doing with this. 2016, a whole year later, they published Distributed Ledger Technology Beyond Blockchain, which sounds like a Marvel movie, and had the sort of level of detail that you'd expect from something which has only had a light touch. In 2017, and this is where the government genuinely see themselves, which is a strange setup given their actions since 2017. They launched their digital strategy, where they announced to everyone that they had the UK ambition for it to be the best place in the world to start a global digital business. That was their ambition. That's what they wanted. They shouted it out for everyone to see. And then, as far as I'm concerned, they've done everything in their power since then to not make that happen. That led to what would be the first. We'll go into a little bit more detail on this, just because I think it's an important point for understanding their stance. But they released in 2018 Cryptoassets Task Force final report. And this was a joint publication between the HMRC, the Bank of England, and the Financial Services Authority, the FCA. And this was them looking at kind of providing details of where they saw crypto assets and effectively where they saw the benefits and the challenges in the future. And which will, I mean, this is the last report that they've issued, which will kind of give us an idea of how they're going to develop and change the regulatory framework in the future. And off the back of that, HMRC published their tax for individuals and their tax for business specialist tax guidelines for people like me to pore over and try and understand what they mean in terms of taxing people's money. So I just want to touch briefly, and I appreciate this is some fairly heavy lifting for after lunch, particularly after all of the interesting sharks with laser beams on their heads. But it is important, and it is something I feel quite passionate about. So the Crypto Assets Task Force report, which was issued in 2018. Firstly, the wording is very key in terms of what they say to start with. Crypto assets. Like the Bank of England, the FCA, basically they see them as assets. They see that it's too volatile at the moment to be a store of wealth, and therefore don't deem it as money or currency. Assets is how they talk about it. How they then describe it and how they then look to tax it is sometimes contradictory to that. But in terms of how they're discussing, they discuss assets. And I'm just going to pick out three phases, tongue twister, from the foreword that they have in there. Now, they say quite a lot of positive things about crypto assets and their benefits on the future and on society, but the three key phrases that I want to pick out. There's growing evidence of harm to consumers and markets. Right there, front and centre, in their summary of the report. And this was back in 2018, so times have moved a bit since then, but not really much. So they're viewing that in terms of that myopic lens. There is harm, or potential for harm, well, not even potential, growing evidence of harm to consumers. And therefore, as Siam said, in terms of where things are going to go over the next years around the Bank of England issuing their own tokens, or their own tokens, basically, they'll look to use that as an opportunity to put their arms around and bring regulation into the industry. So this is something which is inevitable. It's going to happen. They're still consulting with people high up in all the latest crypto companies. Regulation is going to come in. And as that happens, all of this will be chucked out of the water as they try and get their hands on as much of it as they can. And so back in 2018, that was one of the key points they made. The second was that there was limited evidence of current generation of crypto assets delivering benefits. So again, for me, that one actually shows a bit of naivety in terms of they've had all of this information, all of this review that was being carried out in 2018, and they could not see any benefit in it at that point, or limited evidence, let's say, let's be fair to them. Now, me standing here in 2022, is that naivety? Is that stupidity? Well, we've got the benefit of hindsight, and we have had an element of movement since then, and I could levy that accusation at myself. I didn't get into crypto in 2018. For whatever reason, it didn't come on my radar enough for me to think this is something I need to look at. But this is the 3 key pillars of government control. And they had all of the resources available to them, and that was where their point is. So they will want to regulate it, but they need to understand it first. And even after all that point, they didn't really see enough evidence in there for it to be of benefit. And the third point, which comes towards the end of their foreword, which is the one which provides the most context for me, is that the authorities will guard against future threats to financial stability that could emerge in the future. So let that just sink in a second. They're not saying risk or loss or harm. They're looking at guarding against threats to financial stability, to the norm, to the status quo. So what is crypto if not a disruptor to the financial services? And we looked at the impact, we've seen the impact that deregulation of banks had in the 80s, which had a massive impact on the bank's ability to move from just making most of their money from interest into a whole world of financial services. And what they're going to be absolutely panicked about is a disruption to that stability. And again, they will do that via regulation. The other way that they talk about crypto assets, and they talk about DLT. Everything's DLT, distributed ledger technology. I'm probably teaching almost all the room to suck eggs, but just want to be clear on what that means in the context of crypto. So the government provide this document in there. This is a picture taken straight from there in terms of what a centralised ledger is, in terms of how Simon explained it earlier, a ledger which is a single point of failure within a banking regime with everyone collaborating onto that. Distributed ledger technology is about disseminating that information. And there's 4 key pillars of what DLT is: data distribution, decentralization of control, use of cryptography, and programmability. And DLT is sometimes it's used interchangeably with blockchain, but it isn't the same thing. Blockchain is an element that contributes to the use of DLT. So Bitcoin was the first program that used blockchain, and Bitcoin was the first system that effectively pulled all 4 pillars of DLT into one usable setup. But all they're looking at, and all their focus is, whenever they're looking at crypto assets and DLT, is their effect on the financial services setup. They basically categorize it into 3. So they've done a decent... Where are we? There we are. They've done a decent job in understanding the core ideologies and metrics of what DLT is. They categorize it into exchange tokens, security tokens, and utility tokens, which I won't go through the level of detail are, but they basically span the majority of what works within the financial services side of crypto use. However, they then kind of expand that into common assets, and you can just pick out the key words: exchange, payment services, investment, raising capital, investment, raising capital, investment. They're so myopically focused on the disruption and the potential for harm to financial services that they can't get out of any other application from where it sits. This is my opinion. I'll have to say that right back to the original around financial services and financial starts, but this is the key driver that I believe will shape the future of regulation and taxability within the UK. Just check I've covered my main notes. So one key point that they do bring up when they talk about these, which we see as a potential saving grace of crypto, but will actually change the way it's regulated and looked at in the future. I'm going to read this here. It says, the regulatory status of an asset or activity that has been tokenized should not be affected by the use of DLT. So what they're saying there is say we tokenize property. The actual wrapper that we put around that, the fact that we're putting a coin on it or some other use of DLT, should not affect the underlying treatment of that asset. So then when we look at extrapolating that, we tokenize securities, or, USDT even at the moment. What they're saying there is, if you tokenize a security, the fact that you've got it within this DLT wrapper, the HMRC and the regulatory bodies will strip that back and look at what the underlying asset is. So in terms of tokenizing securities in the future, it will fall under FCA guidance is what they're going to look to try and do. None of this is clear at the moment, but they explicitly say there, regulatory status of an asset or activity should not be affected by the use of DLT. So again, trying to put their arms around as much of this as they possibly can.